Okay, and welcome. We are going to be talking about the new Keynesian model today, or at least the initial setup of the new Keynesian model. We're going to be talking about what the differences are between this model and the previous model that we covered, the real business cycle model, namely how this really just sort of improves upon the existing RBC model. And the way in which it improves upon the model actually makes it a broader class of models in which the real business cycle model, or really the class of real business cycle models, are actually a subset or a special case of the new Keynesian model. But we're going to get a little bit further into that when it's actually time to, get to that point. So, like I said before, the real business cycle model was pretty good, especially at explaining supply side shocks. Unfortunately, it kind of sucked when we were looking at demand side shocks, and we needed a model that could give us predictions where demand side and nominal shocks could still have real effects on the economy. Why? Because when we looked at the empirical data that we found, when we modeled everything according to how the real business cycle model should work, basically we put everything in the equilibrium framework of the RBC model using real world data, and then impose shocks consistent with what the real business cycle model should predict, the responses to the shocks were way off than from what the real business cycle model said we should have had. So there's an issue there that needed to be fixed. This is that answer. So we need to find a way to have nominal shocks transmit into the real economy. So really, we got to change a couple of things, meaning we need different underlying assumptions in the model. Now, a lot of the assumptions are pretty similar, but here are a couple of the differences. First, the two welfare theorems of economics are not satisfied. Remember, in the real business cycle model, everything was a perfectly efficient equilibrium. So even if we were in a recession, the two welfare theorems were still satisfied, meaning that was an efficient equilibrium, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you think about it, because things aren't efficient if you're in a recession. That's kind of the definition of a recession. There's a restructuring going on. Things weren't efficient that led up to it. And during that adjustment phase in the recession, we become more efficient, hence we leave the recession. But that's not to say that every point in time is going to be a perfectly efficient equilibrium. That's just not how this stuff works. So, in addition to that, remember the RBC model said that there was said that there was no monopolistic competition. It was a perfectly competitive equilibrium across all markets. Here, at least one of the markets has a monopolistically competitive framework, meaning that there is some allowance for a markup of price above marginal cost. Ricardian equivalence does not hold here. Monetary neutrality, similarly, does not hold. Prices don't fully adjust immediately in response to shocks. Some of them might, but not all of them will. And that's going to have a pretty substantial impact when considering what's going to be happening when there is a demand side shock. If prices can't fully adjust, that means output is going to have to adjust instead. Therefore, policymakers are going to be facing trade-offs when using policy to impact the business cycle. The fiscal authority is going to be concerned about trying to maintain their budget, basically keeping the budget somewhat balanced, while at the same time being able to impact the business cycle with countercyclical fiscal policy. And the monetary authority, or the central bank, in our case the Federal Reserve, is going to face a trade-off between output and inflation. If they want higher output, that's fine. They're going to have to spark higher inflation in order to get there. And this model is going to show us exactly how this stuff actually works. So this is a much more accurate model. It's a much more widely used model when it comes to policy, especially now. This model really has been dominating the policy sphere for the last, pretty much ever since it showed up. So let's talk about how these differences in the underlying assumptions actually lead to different results from the model. Now, we're going to start with the household. So if we're going to be like making a movie here, this is going to be the first character in the movie. Now, the household has a similar utility function to what they had before. They still choose between consumption and leisure, just like before. So not much is all that different, except there is one exception. They get utility from holding real money balances, or this lowercase mt. So their utility function is a function of consumption, leisure, and real money balances. So they decide how much they want to consume, they decide how much they want to work, and how much money they want to actually hold. Now, there are some sort of theoretical issues that certain economists have taken over the years with including real money balances in the utility function. But overall, it's generally considered pretty okay form just to use that. And it also allows us to derive a money demand equation, which is going to have a little bit better of a predictive capability when trying to establish what's going to be happening as far as the equilibrium is concerned within money markets themselves. So there's not much more to say about the households, really. So I just say, fuck it, and let's move on to the next character in the movie, which is going to be the firm. Now, the firms in the real business cycle model were identical, and they produced one aggregate output good, YT. But that wasn't very realistic. There was no heterogeneity across production. There was no heterogeneity across different types of firms producing different types of goods because there weren't different types of goods being produced. But in an actual aggregate economy, you've got tons of different goods being produced. So instead of a lot of identical firms, there are a bunch of firms, say J, that produce various final consumer goods. And they face a demand curve where the price they set is a markup above marginal cost. We'll call that markup mu, which is that goofy looking U thing. It's actually mu. And it's dependent on the elasticity of demand faced by firm J, which is theta sub J. So this means that if demand becomes more inelastic, firms can charge a markup over marginal cost, or more of a markup over marginal cost, and extract a little bit of consumer surplus, which is good for them, not necessarily great for the consumer. But there is a very fundamental reason why that assumption is built into the model, and it's not just because not every market in the real world is actually competitive. There's one other reason that it exists. So each firm J faces a demand curve that looks something like this. Now, what we have is the C sub JT, basically the consumption of good J at time T, is equal to the ratio of the price that firm J charges for their good relative to all other prices, capital PT, and that's raised to the power of negative theta J. So it's this price ratio, P sub JT over PT, to the negative theta, where that negative theta is the elasticity of demand. So depending on what the elasticity of demand is, the firm will price something P sub JT that will be above marginal cost, therefore allowing them to extract a little bit of consumer surplus. However, like I said, in a moment, we will see that there is also something else there's something else afoot here, boys. So this theta is the elasticity of demand for good J. Now, necessary addition for two reasons. One, more realistic assumption, like I said. Two, it allows firms to set prices above marginal cost today so that if they can't change their prices for the next few periods, they're not operating at a massive loss. Because remember I said prices were sticky, they were slow to adjust. It's what's known as a nominal rigidity. We'll get to that in a second. So if these prices are slow to adjust, the firm has to be able to set their price above marginal cost today so that when these certain shocks hit, they're sort of covering their asses in the future because they're setting their price based on what they expect prices to be, not just today, tomorrow, or 2 days from now, but also where they expect the entire system to be, let's say, a couple of months from now. Because it could be the better part of a year before they can change their prices, which isn't a particularly good thing if you're a firm and you're setting your price equal to marginal cost. That's called you're doing okay now, but the next shock that hits, you're screwed. And if you have to go a year where your price is now way too low, you're like super screwed. That's not a good thing. So they set their price above what they what a naturally efficient level would be, because they understand that in the future there is going to be a push where the price should actually, they'll sort of, once that demand shock hits, it's going to drive the price a little bit closer to where they actually set the price. So they're sort of forward-looking and trying to cover their asses. We'll get into this in a little bit. So why won't they be able to change prices in the next few periods? Well, like I said, this is a nominal rigidity, meaning it's a nominal variable that can't move as much as it would normally be able to in a flexible price equilibrium, like where we had the real business cycle model. The real business cycle model had 0 nominal rigidities, but there's a lot of nominal rigidities in this particular model. So here's a good way to think about this, right? Let's say you're the CEO of Subway, and you've been campaigning on this $5 footlong sub for a little while now. And it's been so heavily used that it pretty much sticks in everybody's head. They go to Subway, they expect to get a $5 footlong. But then there's some economic shock that comes in, stimulates aggregate demand, and so you get this massive influx of additional customers. You'd like to be able to change your prices, but it's kind of hard for you to do that. Why? Well, it's going to be a really bad PR move if you're like, oh, I'm going to change my prices now, right in the middle of this particular price setting campaign. So you're going to keep the footlong priced at $5 for the time being. Now, according to the new Keynesian model, when you started this little campaign here of $5 footlongs, what was going on was the marginal cost of that footlong was probably a little bit less than $5. Let's say it was like $4 or $4.50, just anything less than $5. They set it equal to $5 knowing that they're going to be campaigning on this for probably a couple of years before they actually try to change it. So they're sort of accounting for future shocks before they hit, because they're going, all right, I know where things are going to go, or at least I have some general idea of where things are going to go. So I'm going to set the price a little bit higher than what it should naturally be if prices were flexible, because I'm not going to be able to change this price for quite some time afterwards. So you set it a little bit above what the marginal cost of production is. You get a little bit of economic profit. You extract some consumer surplus from that. And once this demand shock hits, or multiple demand shocks hit, before you can actually change your price, chances are, even though you're coming out ahead at the beginning, you're going to break even at one point, and then you might actually end up coming out at a loss for a little while before you can change your prices. So depending on how you discount the future, what might actually be happening is you're completely and totally breaking even. Because ultimately what's going on, right now the marginal cost of production is, say, $4. So you're getting $1 of economic profit for each sub that you sell. That's pretty cool. But that's when you optimized at marginal revenue equals marginal cost. You found the optimal level of production, and that was the absolute best profit maximizing, cost minimizing level of production. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But if this demand shock comes in, you've got to make more. So if you have to make more, what happens is marginal revenue is no longer equal to marginal cost. You're not optimizing anymore. It's not an optimal level of production that's being utilized here. Because your prices are sticky, you can't change the price. So you're setting the price above the optimal price because you know in the future that might actually be kind of close to what the optimal price will be at that point in time. So you're making extra money now because you know that you're probably going to be losing out in the future. Now, there could be other reasons that the price can't move as much. It's not just like a bad PR thing here. Let's say you work at the corporate office at Outback Steakhouse. Why there? Because, well, I worked at Outback for like years. Now, there's the exact same economic shock that hits Subway, and you know that you're going to have to raise your prices to adjust to the new demand. That means raising all the prices at every Outback restaurant. Now, that's going to be a little bit of a pain in the ass, because I don't know exactly how many Outbacks there are, but there's probably at least a couple of hundred just in the United States. My guess is probably, over 1,000, probably a couple thousand worldwide. You got to print a lot of new menus. You have to get the new look approved by marketing. You probably have to come up with some new sleazy campaign where you remodel a bunch of your stores, really to help justify the price hike. Now, I'm not 100% sure that that's what's going on, but I'm kind of thinking that's what happened when I was working there between 2007 and 2012. We renovated the store, I believe, twice that I was working at. And the second renovation in 2011 was like a substantial overhaul of the entire store. Everything changed. And looking at that being a little bit after the financial crisis, I'm wondering if that sort of aggregate demand shock that got triggered, we'll talk a little bit about that in the last lecture, but it triggered an aggregate demand shock, or at least the policy response to the financial crisis triggered an aggregate demand shock. And Outback's like, well, we got to up our prices. Well, one way to do it would be to remodel a bunch of the stores, renovate them, make them look newer, go for a new, like, more polished, casual look rather than just like, hey, come to Outback. And I can't do an Australian accent, so I'm not even going to bother. Oh, crikey or something. I don't know. I'm terrible. I'm absolutely terrible at that. So they kind of went for a different sort of look, which then, of course, justifies more of a price hike. But all of this costs the firm. So you face the cost of printing new menus, and these are actually called menu costs in the model. But you also need to justify the price hike a bit so you don't lose out on business for raising prices, because people are going to be pissed, right? If Outback just raised their price and then the store looked exactly the same, it's like, what the hell am I? Yeah, I've been coming here a while, and I like the store and all. I like your steaks, but I mean, really? This $9.99 6-ounce sirloin is now like $13.99? What the hell, man? Because a lot of times consumers don't really understand that, the inflationary push is going to be, well, raising inflation, hence prices are going to go up. So they're going to be kind of pissed about that. So they're not going to be very happy. And let's say a competitor, Longhorn, don't raise their prices at the same time that you do. Well, people just go to Longhorn instead of Outback, and you kind of screw yourself over. So you may end up in a situation where it's cheaper to just not raise the price for a while, and you do so a little bit later, meaning that there are nominal rigidities faced in the real world. These nominal rigidities, in this case, are called sticky prices, and incorporating it was a relatively tough thing to figure out for the guys that were trying to develop the new Keynesian model. Now, there's other types of sticky prices. There's, say, sticky wages. For example, if you sign a contract with a company to work with them for a year, well, your wage is locked in for a year. So whatever inflationary pressures there are that occur over that year doesn't matter because, well, you're getting paid the same amount. That's a sticky wage. Now, you can renegotiate a higher wage when it's time to sign a new contract. But until then, they're under no obligation to pay you any more or less than what the contract says they're going to pay you. In fact, they're actually under obligation to pay you exactly what they said they were going to pay you because that's how contracts work. So these modelers had to find a way that they could allow for prices to be slow to adjust that could mathematically be incorporated into the model. Sure, the intuition, I just went through, probably 8 minutes or so of explaining the intuition of sticky prices to you. But, okay, that's all well and good, but we need a way to actually incorporate this mathematically into the model. Why do we have to do that? Well, we want to be able to test the model. And the only way we can test the model is, going out and gathering data and running all sorts of statistical analysis, which means we need a functional form to actually test. And part of that functional form needs to be a parameter that allows for prices to be slow to adjust that's included in the model. So how do we do that? Well, the idea actually ended up being pretty simple. Let's just say that there's a fraction of firms, omega, it's like a little cursive looking W, but it's an omega, that can't change their prices each period. And there's a fraction 1 minus omega of firms that can change their prices each period. Well, you can think of it like a probability. If omega equals 0.15, 15% of firms can't change their prices each period, whether there's a shock or not, and the other 85% can change their prices. So that means you've got a 0.15 probability that you can't change your price next period, and a 0.85 probability that you can change your price next period. So really all they did was they just went, okay, cool. It's just a probability, omega times some firms, plus 1 minus omega times those firms, and that will tell me exactly how many firms can change their prices and how many firms can't. Okay, cool. This mechanism is what's known as Calvo pricing. Presumably it's named after a guy named Calvo, but who knows? Now, firms have to be forward-looking when they're setting their prices. Like I was saying before, they have to think a couple of periods into the future. Because let's say omega is 0.15, there's a 15% chance that they won't be able to make any changes each period. So they set their price above what it would normally be to cover their asses for the future. And every successive period, omega is raised to a higher power. So for the first period, the probability is just omega to the first power, or just omega. Second period, omega squared. Third period, omega cubed, and so on. Now, the nice thing is, omega is between 0 and 1. And any number between 0 and 1 raised to a higher power gets smaller. So as the future goes on, right, 0.15 squared is less than 0.15 to the first power. 0.15 cubed is less than 0.15 squared. So eventually, what happens is, as you get further and further into the future, so as t approaches infinity, you will be able to change your prices again. But you just don't know exactly when. So in the short run, firms can't change their prices, but in the long run, all of them can. Meaning in the long run, prices are fully flexible. Does this sound a little familiar? Yeah, it should, because it's what lines up with what the RBC model suggests. This is what's known as the neoclassical synthesis. There's a synthesis between the neoclassical, or real business cycle model, and the new Keynesian models. New Keynesian models work better in the short run, but the RBC model works really well in the long run. So, hence the neoclassical synthesis. Now, firms also have rational expectations. Now, what are rational expectations? Well, I guess we have to make a little trip over to game theory here. And in game theory, rational expectations is really just a statement that each player, or an assumption that each player in a game will have full and complete information on what the other players are going to do. So, if you're playing a game with somebody, and you've got rational expectations, you know what the other player's objective function is. You know what their payoffs are going to be from each decision that they make, so you know what decision they're going to want to make. So they basically know, in this case, firms will know what the central bank's, which is the third character in our movie, objective function is, which we'll get a little bit further on the central bank's objective function later, but rational expectations actually show up everywhere. It's not just in economics or game theory. If we want to know a good case for this assumption appears elsewhere, let's ask the 7 psychopaths from the movie 7 Psychopaths in 2012.
Comfortable? Cell phone's off, right? Okay, here we go. Exterior. Cemetery. Night. The shootout. Yeah. The Jacko Diamonds is waiting there with Bonnie, and he's arranged to give him back and have this whole thing end, because all he really wants is peace. You know, like Gandhi, or Jesus, or that other guy. Anyway, he's waiting there for the mafia boss, who's agreed to show up alone and unarmed, but yeah, guess what?
Oh, wait a minute. Surely he knows that the mafia boss is a psycho. Why would he believe he'd show up alone and unarmed? You know?
Yeah. Exactly! Maybe the Jacko Diamonds was expecting to get double-crossed, because he just happens to have brought a couple of friends along. Suddenly, from out of every fucking grave, burst the 7 psychopaths, a gun in every hand. Flamethrower! Who the fuck is that? It's the Viet Cong guy! He was hiding up a tree!
Because there's absolutely nothing better than Christopher Walken coming out of a grave with 2 pistols and shooting people. At least I think so. I don't know. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're not crazy like I am. So the idea here is that firms know if the central bank's going to want to inflate the money supply to try to stimulate output. So they set their prices in advance knowing the central bank is going to do this. Normally, you'd think that this would just render policy useless in the real economy. But that omega term is what allows for firms with rational expectations to still be unable to adjust fully and properly. Think about supply and demand. If prices can't adjust in a supply and demand framework, what has to respond? Well, it's output. Because we got just price and output. If price can't respond fully, then output's going to have to pick up that slack, so to speak. So if prices are sticky and firms can't change prices as much as they want, they have to respond through altering output instead. So if you run a Taco Bell and you sell 100 tacos a day and there's a demand shock, and the new demand is for 200 tacos in a day, you've got one of 2 options. Raise the price to keep making 100 tacos, or make more than 100 tacos. Now, if prices are perfectly sticky, omega is equal to 1, you're going to have to make 200 tacos because you can't change your price at all. If prices are only kind of sticky, let's say omega equals 0.4, well, then there is a 40% probability you can't change your prices. So what you're going to do is you're going to plan to be able to produce 140 tacos if it's required, rather than just 100 tacos. That's kind of the mechanism through which the sticky price framework operates. Now, in the supply-demand framework, it means we still only have one aggregate demand curve. But now we're going to have two aggregate supply curves. We're going to have a short-run aggregate supply curve, or SRAS for short, which is an upward-sloping aggregate supply curve, and its slope is determined by omega, as well as a couple of other things which we'll get into in a minute. The larger omega is, the flatter the curve is going to be. And then there's a long-run aggregate supply curve. This is a vertical supply curve predicted by the RBC model. When prices become perfectly flexible in the long run, we move over to this curve for analysis rather than using the short-run aggregate supply curve. So here's the cool thing about this. Firms base the price based on omega. So what if omega was equal to 0? Meaning all firms could change their prices in response to any shock whatsoever. Well, in that case, the whole model reduces down, it simplifies to the flexible price model, and we get the exact same results and predictions as the RBC model. So the RBC model is really a special case of the new Keynesian model. Now that's pretty neat. Like, it's really cool actually, because that's like, okay, well, in the short run, if omega goes to 0, it's just the real business cycle model. In the long run, omega goes to 0, and we get the real business cycle model. So it falls within the framework of the new Keynesian model. Although, so of course, I'm sure you're probably cursing me at this point, going like, oh my God, you made me learn all that graphing stuff with the RBC model. Well, yeah, of course I did. Why? Because we're sort of learning a history of economic thought, and we're doing it by learning what the modeling actually is. The RBC model came first, the new Keynesian model came second, and it improved on the RBC model. So if you want to know good business cycle macro modeling, the RBC model's where you start. And then once you get that, once you understand how that works, we can complicate it further and go up to the new Keynesian model. So this means that the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework looks like this. Now, it looks almost identical to what the real business cycle model predicted, except this short-run aggregate supply curve pops up. So if there's a demand shock, what happens is normally the demand shock would shift out. So let's say aggregate demand is over here now, and we would just jump up to this price level. Now, the new Keynesian model suggests that there's a short-run adjustment process where if the aggregate demand curve comes out over here, we start here. Output's higher, prices are higher, but prices don't adjust as much as they would as if they were here. This would be the full price adjustment. This would be the partial price adjustment. So we end up here, output's higher, translates over and up, wages will be higher, unemployment will be lower because employment goes up, output is higher, prices aren't very high yet. But in the long run, this short run aggregate supply curve is going to begin to shift inward, and it's going to shift inward up to the point where the new aggregate demand curve, let's say it crosses here, intersects with long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply. And I'll explain the process through that works in a different video. So at the aggregate, in the short run, slowly adjusting prices mean output can respond to demand-side shocks. And there's an equation for this in the model that's known as the new Keynesian Phillips curve. It says that there's a trade-off between output and inflation, and it looks like this. So you're probably like, wow, what the hell is that? Geez, this guy's just, ugh. So, yeah, it looks like it's just a bunch of math. So let's get it to make more sense so we can actually get some sort of intuitive economic, like, reasoning, understanding, whatever out of this. So let's start by defining what this phi hat is. Now, phi hat is called the output gap, and it's expressed in terms of a percentage deviation of output from the flexible price output. It's the difference between the new Keynesian sticky price output and the RBC's flexible price output, and it's equal to this. And this gamma is going to be something that shows up in a little bit. So this YT hat is the sticky price output, and this YTF is the flexible price output. So if the sticky price output is below the flexible price output, meaning it's less, right, the output gap is negative. If it's larger, the output gap is positive. And this gamma really sort of determines what the elasticity is on that. And that elasticity is going to show up when we're looking at the slope of the new Keynesian Phillips curve. So policymakers at the central bank, who's going to be the third character in this movie, have an incentive to minimize this output gap as much as humanly possible. Now, one might think they'd always want it to be positive, but the thing is, it's actually bad to have this thing be positive for a prolonged period of time. If the economy is always producing above its natural rate of output, then it's going to get pushed beyond capacity for too long, driving inflation upward, and that's bad. So the only way that you would be able to consistently have this thing be a positive is to constantly be pushing aggregate demand outward. But if productive capacity isn't changing, then you'll get a little bit of a boost in output in the short run, but in the long run, firms are going to be able to raise their prices as a rationing mechanism. Because remember, like I said before, price is just a rationing mechanism. It's all that it is. So they're going to ration how much they actually have to produce. So as they can be able to do that and update their prices, and this keeps going on, well, what's going to happen is firms are just going to go, fine, screw it. We're going to keep raising our prices. And as they keep raising their prices higher and higher and higher, well, the inflation rate's going to increase. And you end up with very, very high inflation and output ultimately just approaching what its natural rate is in the long run anyways. And that's nowhere near as good as low inflation with output being at its natural rate. So the new Keynesian Phillips curve is actually the short-run aggregate supply curve in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. The slope's equal to gamma, which is dependent on omega. So let's talk about this kappa tilde thing. This kappa tilde is equal to this, 1 minus omega times 1 minus beta times omega over omega. So what the hell is that? Well, basically what that's doing is that's telling us what the relationship is between sticky prices and then that beta. Remember, the beta was the discount factor for the household's optimization problem. So it incorporates the household's time preferences in responding to aggregate demand shocks. So we have this guy here. This is what the new Keynesian Phillips curve looks like with all the stuff substituted in. So this explains the price adjustment mechanism and the role that household preferences play in how the economy is going to be responding to aggregate demand shocks, because this is an aggregate supply curve. Remember, so this guy will be staying fixed during an aggregate demand shock, and this is going to describe how that's going to be moving. Now, this is the actual slope of the new Keynesian Phillips curve. Inflation is equal to this stuff. This is expected inflation, or what we expect inflation to be tomorrow, hence rational expectations, plus gamma times the relationship or the sticky price mechanism that we see times this YT hat, which is the actual output. So gamma times this stuff times YT hat means the slope is gamma times this crap. That's the relationship between inflation and output. So this is the slope. Prices get stickier, omega increases, gamma decreases, meaning if gamma is small, the short-run aggregate supply curve is really shallow and thus flatter. But the central bank can't control anything in that part besides inflation. So the new Keynesian Phillips curve only acts as a constraint on monetary policy decision-making, and it's not the central bank's actual objective function. Instead, their objective function is to choose a policy that minimizes inflation while closing the output gap, but they need a policy tool to do that. Now, the policy function they use, this is not their objective function, this is a policy function that they're using, is what's referred to as the Taylor rule, and it's named after John Taylor, an economist who in 1993 discovered how the Federal Reserve Bank sets their interest rates to manage real economic activity. And it looks something like this. And you're like, whoa, what the hell is that? Well, fortunately, I'm here to help you. So from this, we've got the nominal interest rate set by the Fed, which is this RT, capital RT, being equal to the current inflation rate and the target real interest rate plus some other stuff. So if you're thinking the other stuff, the first component in that other stuff is alpha pi times pi t minus pi t star, not pi t equals pi t star. That's a mistake on my part. Look at equation 8. Don't look at this bullet point here. Pi t minus pi t star. It's a measure of the percentage deviation of inflation from their target rate of inflation, which in the U.S. right now, the Fed's target rate is about 2% per year. Now, this alpha y times yt hat minus yt hat f is a measure of the percentage deviation of the new Keynesian model's output and the flexible price output from the real business cycle model. Excuse that burp. I did my best to mute it. The alpha terms tell us how much the Fed cares about inflation, alpha pi, and output, which is alpha y. So from this guy, we have two different types of policymakers at the Fed. We have inflation hawks, in which case they care more about stabilizing inflation, keeping the current inflation rate close to its target rate, than they do minimizing the output gap, meaning they care more about stabilizing inflation. They believe stabilizing inflation will stabilize the output gap. On the other hand, an inflation dove is going to care more about stabilizing the output gap than they will stabilizing inflation, meaning an inflation dove is willing to accept a higher rate of inflation if it means either closing the output gap or making it positive for some amount of time. Now, if we're in a recession and inflation's relatively low, then the Fed's going to aim for more dovish policies, because at that point we can deal with a little bit more inflation in order to boost output. So these alpha terms can really sort of be thought as depending on the state of the economy. So there's a state dependence going on. Now, of course, as we see here, there's no T subscript in either of the alpha terms, but things can be tweaked within the model to allow for a more state-dependent outcome here. So what the Fed will actually do is set a monetary aggregate to achieve a nominal interest rate RT that's consistent with the Taylor rule. Now, from this Taylor rule, if inflation is equal to its target and output is equal to the flexible price output, then alpha pi times pi t minus pi t star plus alpha y times yt hat minus yt hat f equals 0. Inflation's equal to its target, output gap is 0. The Taylor rule reduces down to this. And there's no need for the central bank to use monetary policy to influence the business cycle, which would end up being the perfect scenario predicted by the real business cycle model, and hence we would have monetary neutrality. There would be no need for any countercyclical monetary policy in this case. So before, the central bank was completely unable to influence output with any sort of monetary policy, but now it can. So the question becomes, how is it that they can do this? Well, it's because of that sticky prices, but that's not the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. A transmission mechanism of monetary policy is how it transmits a nominal monetary policy shock into a real shock where output is responding. Now, the Taylor rule is what identifies this transmission mechanism, and it identifies it as the real interest rate. So if you look at the ISLM graph in the new Keynesian model, it's the same as what we have in the real business cycle model, but with an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Aggregate demand shocks have real effects. So the variable it transmits through, if you remember the ISLM graph, it had the real interest rate on the vertical axis and it had output on the horizontal axis. So the variable that it's actually transmitting through was the real interest rate, that vertical axis variable. And it works because of the Fisher equation. And really the Taylor rule, if we go back to the Taylor rule, and we'll keep it like this. That Taylor rule, if you look at it, it's just an addition or an augmentation of the Fisher equation. So the Taylor rule is just the Fisher equation when the Fisher equation isn't really enough to explain what's going on. If there's a difference between the sum of the inflation rate and the target real interest rate, right, if that thing does not sum up to what the nominal interest rate is, well, there's something else that needs to be explaining it. What's that other something else? Well, it's that alpha pi times the inflation deviations plus alpha y times output deviations. So the Taylor rule augments the Fisher equation. So if prices are slow to adjust, inflation doesn't pick up the slack because it can't, because the inflation rate isn't high enough to be what it should be. The real interest rate responds, which transmits over to output that way. So the only policy tool, though, isn't just what the central bank uses, because there's a fourth character in this movie, the fiscal authority, or like the federal government. They can either tax at a rate tau t or borrow by selling bonds today, b sub t plus 1, at a price qt and an interest rate rt superscript b. And the idea for how the government operates is based on some theories by an economist named John Maynard Keynes. Who? Well, I mean, new Keynesian model. Shit, maybe it's named after him. Oh, yeah. Hey, what do you know? It actually is. This is John Maynard Keynes. He was a world-famous economist through, I believe, the early to mid-20s up until his death, which I believe was somewhere in the early 1940s. He wrote a book called The General Theory of, I believe, like money, interest rates, something or other. It's just referred to as The General Theory. I've read numerous chapters out of that book. It's absolutely fantastic. And he's really considered to be the father of modern macroeconomic thought. Now, his ideas were put to work during the Great Depression, and they've dominated countercyclical fiscal policy ever since. His idea was simple, yet sadly, consistently misinterpreted and misunderstood. And he's sadly misinterpreted because really all he said was you want to have high taxes and low spending during an economic boom and develop an economic or like a budget surplus within the government yourself. And then when we enter a recession, you dump that surplus and then maybe take on some additional deficit spending if the surplus wasn't enough into the economy in order to boost gross domestic product. He argued that recessions were caused by slack demand, so recessions were demand side rather than supply side. So it's a very different view than what the RBC model suggests, because the RBC model, remember, said that recessions were all supply side. Now, he's arguing that the origin of certain shocks that would drive us into a recession could be demand side. Where's the real truth? Well, it's probably somewhere in the middle, and the new Keynesian model actually does a pretty good job of suggesting that it's likely somewhere in between the two different types of classical models and older Keynesian models. The classical models were basically all supply side, and the Keynesian models were almost all demand side, and the reality is probably somewhere in between the two. So he argued if recessions are caused by slack demand, what you're seeing is an inward shift of an aggregate demand. And if aggregate demand's shifting inward, well, it's slack. The government could stimulate demand by boosting government spending to offset the reductions in consumption and investment. And it was a pretty revolutionary idea. And he's the guy this model's named after. And he's also the guy that we can thank for that, say, $787 billion stimulus bill in 2008, 2009. And the $2.2 trillion stimulus from earlier this month in order to keep the U.S. economy afloat during the COVID-19 outbreak. That's all Keynesian macroeconomic theory put to work. So there is a role for government spending within this model because, again, aggregate supply is not vertical anymore. It's upward sloping, at least in the short run. So a government spending shock will shift aggregate demand like it did in the real business cycle model, but there are going to be short-run effects where output goes up rather than not at all, like what we saw in the real business cycle model. And despite that, the new Keynesian model tends to favor monetary policy over fiscal policy for a couple of reasons. And those reasons are, first, fiscal policy is kind of slow to get passed. Think about Congress, right? If we actually just think about what happened in Congress while they were trying to pass that $2.2 trillion spending bill, how long was that held up in Congress? It was held up for, I think, at least a week. And so this takes weeks to get stuff in, really just to get stuff passed by Congress to get to the president's desk to be signed. And in all honesty, especially at the beginning of a huge crisis like what we're seeing right now, days matter. These guys take weeks, sometimes even months, and days matter. So maybe that's not the best solution or the best approach to looking at this. Now, sadly, it can take weeks to get this stuff passed. Why? Well, because every congressman, regardless of party affiliation, is rationally self-interested. Because really the order that they care about things is first, getting reelected. That's step one. Step two are their constituents. They're worried about making sure that their constituents like them. So what do? Well, they engage in something that's known as pork barreling. They basically bring home the bacon to their constituents. So they want to make sure that their district or their state is getting a substantial amount of this spending, because if it doesn't, well, then that looks bad. They look like ineffective policymakers who aren't representing the interests of their constituents very well. And then finally, third, they actually care about the overall well-being of the U.S. And sadly, that's kind of a backwards and very twisted incentive structure, and there's not much incentive compatibility to have things pushed through immediately, because the reason you want things to be pushed through immediately are sadly the third priority on their list, and in the order of being the third priority, not the first. Their first priority is not the American people. Their first priority is getting reelected. The second priority is pleasing their constituents, which helps them get reelected. And the third priority is the U.S. overall. So they're willing to hold stuff up in order to make sure that stuff is passed that pleases their constituents and ensures reelection for them. So to them, there's a little bit of a trade-off that's being faced here. That's not very good. That's not a very responsible way to conduct yourself when you're looking at the overall economy. But on a personal level, well, okay, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Like, it's screwed up, but it makes sense. Now, after that, just because it crosses the president's desk and he signs it does not mean that tomorrow all of that spending kicks in. No, it takes a very long time for that spending to start. For example, that $1,200 stimulus check that's being sent to every household, most of the households have already gotten it. They got it, I believe, as of like Tuesday of this week. I'm recording this on Friday, by the way. I believe it showed up either Tuesday or Wednesday. So that came through, and that was good. But how long ago was this thing signed? I believe it was signed almost a month ago. And it took that long just to get those stimulus checks over to people. And that was for direct deposit. Imagine in the mail. It's going to take even longer. And that was when they were working really hard afterwards in order to actually implement this new policy measure. So these things take time. Not to mention, there's going to be a lagged effect of government spending on the way output is going to respond. Just because your income was boosted from that $1,200 stimulus check doesn't mean output's immediately going to respond. You probably won't see a response in output until, at least a month from now. Maybe 2. So you're seeing a pretty slow and lagged effect here. That's not good. We don't like that. We really don't like that. On the other hand, monetary policy has much faster effects. The Federal Open Market Committee members, the guys that actually vote on monetary policy in the United States, can vote very quickly to intervene in the economy, and it's much more effective. So really, even though the government can have real effects in this case, they can have stimulus spending boost aggregate demand in the short run, even if it's a supply-side shock. Well, demand is eventually going to decrease as well, because if supply falls, well, incomes will fall because production is falling. Eventually, when incomes fall, aggregate demand is going to shift inward. So even if the source was a supply-side shock, you can still use demand-side or demand-oriented policy to stimulate stuff, at least in the short run, while you try to get the productive capacity of the supply side back in check. But the government's still kind of treated like the kid that eats glue in the corner. So here is the government right here. So Microsoft's Internet Explorer and government are really pretty much the same. Just switch the E out with a G, and that's government. If government was a gun, this is what government would be like. And if you want to see elected officials trying to shoot a gun, to be like, look at how pro-gun I am and how awesome I am because I can shoot a gun, this is what you get, and you have incredibly poor form. That stance is nightmarish. The way he's holding that shotgun is just awful. I guarantee you, whatever he is shooting at, he's not hitting. Well, maybe he is because it's a shotgun blast, but that's really just sort of by default, and that's not actually because like he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. So, if these are what elected officials look like when they're trying to shoot guns, maybe they don't need to be shooting guns. They definitely don't need to shoot that gun because, sadly, even though government is the kid that's eating glue in the corner like this, sadly, we still need government to do things. Just because I'm saying that fiscal policy measures are really, really, really stupid sometimes, and they're very slow, that's not to say that there's no need for government. Far from it, actually. It just means that they need to be a little bit more disciplined in the way that they are conducting their policy measures. So, moving forward, now it's time to talk about how everything in this model is going to respond to shocks, and that's going to require a little bit more of a hands-on approach to teaching. So we need like some more hands-on upper management intervention going on here, which means I'm going to switch over to showing you this stuff in person. Well, actually, I guess video. Thanks, COVID-19. And we're going to look at how the model responds to shocks by playing with the same graphs that we had in the real business cycle model, only with that upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Now, because there's that short-run aggregate supply curve, there's going to be a few more moving parts, meaning there's a short-run adjustment process to the long-run equilibrium we see in the RBC model. We will eventually converge to the long-run equilibrium predicted by the RBC, but there's going to be an adjustment process in the short to medium run. So we know in the long run how everything's going to work, which is actually kind of a nice little check to see if we actually get to where we're supposed to be in the new Keynesian model. There are just going to be a few more intermediate steps required to get there. This adjustment phase is what makes it a useful model for policymakers because the whole point is to stabilize the business cycle, make the highs less high and the lows less low, all without inhibiting long-run economic growth. So the way I will finish up this particular lecture is by showing you what the ADAS equilibrium framework is that you're going to need to work with in the new Keynesian model, and it's this right here. And so with that, we will conclude this video and, of course, cue the outro music that, again, will get me sued, this time by Sumerian Records rather than whoever produced stuff for Winger. Actually, I don't know who did this stuff for Shadow of Intent. I don't know who they're working with. Maybe it's Sumerian. It'd be cool if it was Sumerian, because Sumerian is, like, the leading one for, like, really awesome new metal right now. And not new metal like NU metal, like Korn, Limp Bizkit, and all that crap, but new, like, good NEW metal. So, with that, I leave you with Collapse by After the Burial. We're smashed against these glaciers.